may be familiar with classic, well-known fairy tales such as Cinderella, Red Riding Hood and Sleeping Beauty. However, stories like The Goose Girl, Personette or The Good Woman and so many more may be less commonly recognised. The collection of fairy tales prominent in our culture is largely influenced by media such as Disney, yet there exists a wealth of remarkable tales beyond this mainstream selection. In this podcast, we will examine some of these lesser-known narratives, including folk tales, fairy tales and myths, and highlight individuals who are dedicated to preserving and interpreting their unique qualities and enchantment. This is the Lost and Forgotten Fairy Tales podcast. My name is Alyssa Curtayne, and I would love for you to join me on this grand adventure into what is one of the most magical areas of literature, fairy tales. Welcome to the Lost and Forgotten Fairy Tales podcast. My name is Alyssa Curtayne and I am your host of the podcast. And so as our first ever podcast episode, I thought I would introduce myself and my dream for this podcast and for my interest in fairy tales. So you got to know who I am and why I'm making this. It's been in my mind for about 12 to 18 months to make a podcast about fairy tale, and it's not so much the history of fairy tales, which is another area of interest that I have. I'm more interested at this for the podcast in interviewing and talking to people who work with fairy tale, from authors to artists to storytellers to researchers, theatre performers. So I'm interested in how people engage with fairy tales in modern contexts, and also I'm very interested in finding out what their favourite fairy tales were as a child and how that influenced them. And as we'll discuss when we talk about my background story, fairy tales have played an important role in the development of my values, which I think is a really understated part of literature and probably under-researched, but that's another story. So my earliest memory of fairy tales was when I was about 8. I loved to read, and I've got 2 or 3 books that I'm very, very passionate about. One is a 2-book Reader's Digest collection. It's bright green, published in about 1980, and it contains a whole range of beautiful fairy tales with lovely illustrations. And I remember reading deep into the night those stories over and over again. I do remember not reading The Snow Queen because it was so long and I was only little, but all the others I read over and over again. And the other book I had was a book by Eric and Lucy Kincaid, and the illustrations in that were magical, and I still have it. It's one of my most treasured possessions, this book, Tales of Enchantment it is. And I didn't know that there was a collection of folk tales in that book until later, and I started researching fairy tales and folk tales and realised that my entire treasured collection of books are variants of folk and fairy tale and sometimes myth. So it was something that came really naturally to me to fall in love with fairy tales. They became a companion and a safe place for me. And while through adulthood and growing up, I sort of forgot about that, it wasn't until I went through a crisis in 2020 that I realised that this magical pathway for me was always there. I did a storytelling show all about this particular phase of my life, and I'll put the link in the notes and stuff so you can watch it if you want to. But fairy tales became a really important part of who I am, even though they'd been absent from my life for many years. And interestingly, my children didn't gravitate to them. They loved reading, but they didn't gravitate to them. They were more interested in what was really popular at that time, which were the graphic novels and things like that, even though I tried pushing them in classics direction. So my favourite fairy tale as a child was Snow White and Rose Red. And you'll notice on my YouTube I've got 2 videos about Snow White and Rose Red. I love that story. It has been my favourite story since I was very little, And what I love about it is the love between the sisters. And despite the fact that there are some politically incorrect possible readings of the dwarf in that, the area and I don't want to brush over that, that's a different issue altogether. What I am interested in is the relationship between the girls and how they supported each other and how they loved each other, and they lived in a very harmonious, beautiful family dynamic with their mother. And later on in life, I became a single mother and hadn't made that connection. And quite often fairy tales don't necessarily have both mother and father, or they have a parent and a step parent. So, you know, parents are quite often absent, which is a whole other issue altogether. So Snow White and Rose Red and the values in the fairy tales really framed my personal values about kindness and compassion and helping other people. And I perhaps think that, you know, a lot of them, like Snow White and Rose Red, was probably a didactic tale originally by the woman who penned it first. She was a teacher, and I think she just wanted to make children behave, and as a way of making children behave, that's a great thing. But again, I don't want to digress into that too much. So Snow White and Rose Red, I'll link the video that I've told that story in the notes. But if you haven't heard of it, it's about two girls who live with their mother alone in the forest.
You may have heard of Snow White, but have you heard of Snow White and Rose Red? It's a story from the Grimm's collection by a woman called Carolyn Starr. It goes something a little bit like this. Once upon a time, in a kingdom a long time ago, there was a woman, and she lived in a little cottage in the forest. Outside her front door, she had roses of red and roses of white. And inside she had two beautiful daughters who were named Snow White and Rose Red. Now these sisters loved each other very much, and they would do everything together. Snow White and Rose Red were as different as two sisters could possibly be. Snow White loved the indoors. She loved helping her mother with the cooking and the mending and all the jobs that were done inside. Rose Red, on the other hand, loved being outside. She loved the forest and running through rivers barefoot and climbing trees and picking up frogs and then releasing them back into the wild. But no matter what, the two sisters loved each other dearly. Their mother felt that they were so safe in the forest, for the forest looked after them. Wild animals would eat out of their hands. Rabbits would come and nuzzle at their feet. And one night, when they had slept late, they had gone late in the forest, they lay down on some soft moss. And in the morning, they woke up to find an angel watching over them. And lucky they did, for had they gone any further, they would have gone over a great ravine. Snow White and Rose Red were the best of friends. In the winter months, the mother would close the door and they would gather the wood and sit around telling stories around the fire, yarning, knitting, repairing things for another season. One very, very bitterly cold night, there came a knock at the door. Snow White opened the door and hid behind her mother, for a great snout came inside the door and sniffed. It said, "Do not be afraid. It is bitterly cold outside. I need somewhere to shelter. Will you shelter me?" Of course, the mother came forward with her two daughters behind her back and checked out this bear, who was as large as the door frame. And she decided that he was safe enough, and she let him come in and sit by the fire. Every night, after the sun had gone down, there was a knock at the door, and a big brown bear came and sat by the fire. And over time, Snow White and Rose Red became accustomed to this warm, fuzzy creature in their home. They even wrestled with him at times. He became their friend. As soon as the snow started to thaw and little plants sprouted out of the ground, the bear said to them, "I must go now. The ground is thawing. My treasures are buried underground and I must watch for the evil dwarfs, the magical kind that hunt my treasures. I must protect them." And the girls said their farewells to the bear. And as he left, his fur caught on the door latch. Snow White was sure she saw a fleck of gold there. Nevertheless, the bear went out into the forest. Life continued and springtime blossomed and all the flowers came out and it was time to be outside again. Rose Red was over the moon with that. She could run in the rivers, pick up the frogs, climb the trees. One day they went out collecting mushrooms and each of them in their baskets carried all the things they needed to gather the mushrooms from the forest. When they heard a yelling from the distance, and as they got closer they saw it was a teeny tiny man with a long beard all the way down to the ground. His beard had been stuck in a wedge in the log. He'd been chopping some wood. And he was jumping and pulling and tugging at his beard trying to get out. "What are you looking at, you stupid girls?" he said to Snow White and Rose Red. And Snow White and Rose Red rushed over at once and tried to pull with all their might to get this beard out. But it didn't work. "Oh, you stupid girls," he said. Rose Red had an idea. She took out her scissors from the basket and snipped the beard right at the bottom. And the little man was freed. "Oh, you silly girls, what have you done? It took me 1,000 years to grow my beard that long. What have you done? You stupid dolts." And he picked up a sack of gold and put it over his shoulder and stomped off into the forest. "What an ungrateful dwarf," said Snow White. "Indeed," said Rose Red. Time passed and the spring just grew more and more rich with green on the trees. Nice breezes coming through and intermittent rain. Girls went to the river one day to go fishing. Just in the corner of their eye they saw what looked like a giant grasshopper jumping up and down. They went over to see what it was, and it was again the man with the long beard, the magical dwarf. His beard had got tangled in the fishing line and a giant fish was on the other end tugging. He was holding on to himself on the ground and the fish was pulling him in. "Oh, you stupid girls, can't you see I need help? Help me!" Of course, the girls went over and tried to untangle, but with the fish and the man and the fishing line, it was just a disaster. Snow White got out her scissors and chopped the beard about halfway down. And the little man was released. "Oh, you stupid girls," he said. "Didn't you know my beard has been growing for 500 years? Look at it." And he picked up a bag of jewels over his shoulder and stomped off into the forest. "What an ungrateful dwarf," said Snow White. "Indeed," said Rose Red. The springtime continued and went into summer. And one sunny morning, their mother asked them to go to the next village to gather some supplies. As they were going, they came across a flat rock in the middle of the field, and the little man with now half a beard was counting his coins. "Oh, stop looking at me, you greedy girls," and he kept his jewels close. The girls continued on to the village, and then they came back later that afternoon. And on their way back, they saw a giant eagle with an arm span as long as a branch. And in its talons had the little man. His beard had been tangled in the talons. The girls at once grabbed his legs and pulled him down, trying to help him. The eagle would not let go. So Rose Red got out her scissors and cut his beard right across the chin. And he fell to the ground. "Oh, you stupid girls, what have you done? My beard is gone. I'm as bare as a baby's bottom." And the girls looked at each other. "This is the last time you'll do this." And he picked up an axe and was just about to attack the girls when out of the forest ran a big brown bear who came and knocked the dwarf to the ground. The girls ran off into the forest. Then they heard a familiar voice. "Snow White, Rose Red, it is me, your bear friend." And when they turned around to see the dwarf down on the ground dead, they saw the bear stand up, and as he stood up, the bear skin fell from his body and stood a young man in front of them. The girls were shocked. How could this be? This man in front of them. I was bewitched by this wicked dwarf and destined to remain a bear, to protect my treasures. And every winter they would go away, but in spring and summer they would come out and start stealing from me again. And I was to remain a bear until he was dead. And so now I can be a man again. Now the bear prince said to the girls that he was indeed a prince, and the girls took him to their mother to reunite with her. He was so grateful for their kindness during his cold winter months that he rewarded them with treasure. But even more, he rewarded them with his presence in the cold winter months when he would come into their home and tell them stories, just like the one I told you. And this was my favourite story as a child, and I hope that you love it too.
I've done a bit of a history of that on another video, but the area that I'm specifically interested in this tale is the friendship and the love between the girls and the way that they support each other, even when they're faced with some horrible sort of awful situation. So there are a lot of things in this story that the dwarf has. It can be anti-Semitic in some interpretations. It can be discriminatory for people with disabilities, and there's quite a lot of good research on how people are represented. People with disabilities are represented in fairy tales. But when I read this story, I'm not thinking of a real human person. I'm thinking of a magical being, a being that exists between this world and another world. So it's not, that's not how I perceive it. The setting, the cottage, the forest, it's all just so pastoral. It's just a beautiful, safe place, and the story is set up as a safe place for the girls. The world is safe for them to be in, and even the bear, which should be the most scary thing in the forest, apart from wolves, is welcomed in. The dangerous thing is welcomed in. So there are, there's only the 5 characters in that story, so it's not got a lot of characters. There's some other tales that I really like that fall into that category of kindness, and I think it's that quality of fairy tales that I really love, that quality of you can be effeminate, you can be feminine, but you can also be strong, you can also be a badass, you can also take down baddies like Molly Whuppie, who again, she has her sisters, she saves her sisters from being eaten by the giant, and then outwits the giant and steals his treasure and runs across a bridge of one hair. So you've got some really strong female characters, and as little girls growing up, we need strong female characters. And what's happened, I think, with the Disneyfication of the happily ever after, and people are not going into the depths of the fairy tale, they're looking at the surface. And of course, a lot of these fairy tales end with happy endings because that's what people want. But the reality of life is people don't end up with happy endings all the time, and folk tales are a really good balance for that. Fairy tales also have a literary element. They are sometimes originally penned and written down stories, as opposed to those that have moved through oral tradition. So there's a bit of a crossover there. And the definition between fairy tale, folk tale is quite fine, and even in academic writing, like if you read academic papers, it's really hard to define what a fairy tale is. I'm a member of the Australian Fairy Tale Society, and we have a definition on our website, but there's always an element of magic in a fairy tale, which differentiates it from a folk tale, which doesn't always have magic, but it does with like talking animals and things like that. So it is a bit of it's a hard thing to define. So now with my work with fairy tales, I do research. So I'm working on the Charlotte Project, which is a deep dive into the fairy tales of 17th century conteuse, Charlotte Rose de la Force. And you can read more about her on my Substack. I'm keeping you updated with my progress on that. And the goal of that would be to end up publishing her fairy tales in full. Probably not word for word as they've done, because she sometimes goes on rambling places with her stories, but they are really drawing on Greek myth, so they're very interesting in that way. I also started a series of lesser known fairy tales, which I made into a book called Yeshen, so the very first written Cinderella in full. There are fragments of the Cinderella tale in ancient Egypt and Greece, but this Chinese, well, probably more northern Vietnamese version of Yeshen is the first full Cinderella tale to be written down. So I wrote a little book about that, and then I discovered Substack, and so all my research now is going on Substack rather than making books. And I also tell stories, so I'm a storyteller, and I love telling fairy tales for children, and I've got a couple of things on the YouTube, and I'm very, very interested in the history of fairy tales and their origins and tracking down. And I know it's almost impossible to find a single point origin for fairy tales, but if you can look at what the authors were influenced by, I think you can see a bit of a trail. There's a trail there of where things came from. For example, the conteuses in the French period were very influenced by Greek mythology, and so they're very influenced by that, and particularly Cupid and Psyche plays a huge role in many of the fairy tales we know today. And so Cupid and Psyche is a fantastic origin point for many of our fairy tales, even though it starts as a myth. And I've got a podcast for storytellers. So this is my second podcast. So that's just a little bit about me. And I didn't want to make this episode too long, so next time we'll be chatting with one of the amazing people that are in the fairy tale community, and one of the goals of this podcast is to bring together people in the fairy tale community and help us to make sure that these beautiful tales are not forgotten, because each one of us has a story that we loved, that may be forgotten, that you're really familiar with, but nobody else knows about. And I think it's worth sharing those, because the world, when it's in crisis, needs storytellers, it needs stories, and it needs fairy tales. And even though it might seem quite excessive at this time in history to be talking about fairy tales, I think if we have deep, meaningful conversations, real conversations about fairy tales, we can actually learn from them and be memory keepers moving forward into whatever this new iteration of humanity will look like moving forward. So that's me. I hope you've enjoyed this little mini introduction and that you can come join us on the next episode where we meet other people and hear about their adventures with fairy tale. And until then, thanks for joining me and thanks for listening all the way.